Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Arabiya English. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's programme, humanitarian agencies in Gaza say they are yet to see a significant ramp-up of aid, which they say is urgently needed to ease famine and suffering in the enclave after 2 years of conflict. We'll get the latest on the situation on the ground. We'll also be speaking to an Israeli peace negotiator and asking him if the hardest part of implementing President Trump's 20-point peace plan is yet to come. All of that on today's edition of GNT. Hello and welcome to the programme. 2 months ago, famine was officially declared in Gaza for the first time, with more than half a million people there lacking food, and after an 11-week siege from March to May. But after the ceasefire deal reached last Friday, there's finally a glimmer of relief as one of its conditions allows humanitarian aid to enter the enclave. Well, still, the situation remains dire. More than 54,000 children are severely malnourished or could die without urgent aid. Well, the UN and the Red Cross are demanding all Gaza crossings be opened, warning that every hour counts. Well, on his way back from his Middle East trip, the US President Donald Trump says he will decide what he thinks is right when it comes to a long-term solution to the Israel-Palestinian conflict. His plan leaves the door open for a possible Palestinian state, but only after a lengthy transition in Gaza and reforms within the internationally recognized Palestinian Authority. Let's take a listen.
I'm talking about something very much different. We're talking about rebuilding Gaza. I'm not talking about single state or double state or two state. We're talking about the rebuilding of Gaza.
What's the road ahead for governing Gaza? Because
a lot of people like the one-state solution. Some people like the two-state solutions. We'll have to see. I haven't commented on that.
How do you see bridging that gap, though? Because you have the Arab countries being very clear about
what I think is right, but I'd be in coordination with other states and other countries.
But are you satisfied? I mean, some people might say it feels premature declaring peace for the whole Middle East. 3,000 years of peace and so on.
You want more people to be killed?
Well, despite the ceasefire, Israel's military says it opened fire earlier on today to remove what it described as a threat posed by suspects who approached its forces in northern Gaza. Well, health authorities in the enclave say at least 6 Palestinians were killed in that Israeli fire. Well, let's get more now. We can speak to Amjad Shawa, who is a Palestinian humanitarian and human rights advocate. He's the director of the Palestinian Non-Governmental Organizations Network and joins us from Gaza City. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Really appreciate it. I mean, apart from the mood, which we're told is a bit more upbeat than it was, has much changed there in Gaza since this ceasefire deal took effect?
Thank you. The big changes that we have, the ceasefire which was applied and the stop of the airstrikes. Second, the Israeli withdrawal from some areas from Gaza, and as a first step forward, the issue of the full withdrawal. The third, which is the return of hundreds of thousands of displaced people who were moved to the south back to the north. But to tell you that, today we have 9 people were killed in Gaza Strip by the Israeli shooting. And the second point, which is still the services in Gaza, which was destroyed, it's in very critical levels, mainly the water, the health, the nutrition facilities, which was also destroyed by the Israelis. And now 1.5 million of the Palestinians, they lost their homes. 90% of the Palestinian homes and the housing system was damaged or destroyed totally. So it's a very challenging point. And every day we are discovering such critical conditions in Gaza as a result of the Israeli destruction. And another challenge which is collecting the bodies under the rubbles of the homes, which enter families still there because we have no enough equipment and personnel that can help us. The unexploded devices, which is also needs for these heavy equipments, which is not there. So it's so many challenges that we are facing as a humanitarian in the work. And the third point, which is the humanitarian supplies, which is supposed to enter according to the humanitarian protocol, according to the deal. We have very limited amount of aid which is getting Gaza Strip, and just 172 trucks for the humanitarian organizations entered last Sunday. Yesterday, there was the swab and the crossings were closed, and today it's kind of Jewish holiday, so the crossings also closed. So nothing entered. And just now, we received the news that Rafah crossing will not be reopened. Also, that we will have less humanitarian supplies to enter by the Israelis. So this kind of announcement really disturbed the Palestinian joy regarding the deal and the relax that we had when it was announced. So now less relax for the Palestinians, and mainly that the displaced people who lost their homes and there is no shelter supplies to offer them, that we are waiting for the winter, and I'm sorry to say that we have no enough shelter supplies to provide to the people. We need for 300,000 tents on time, what had been entered only a few thousands.
Right, yeah, as you say, I mean, 80% of homes in Gaza have been destroyed. So, of course, big questions remain with regards to shelter for people there. But I just wanted to ask you, I mean, obviously, food and scarcity of food and nutrition has been a big issue for several months now in Gaza. But has there been any sort of visible improvement at all during the course of the last 48 hours, or is it just too early to tell?
Yeah, there is kind of improvement, which is light improvement that we witnessed, but it cannot deal with the issue of famine that, from the 2 months ago that Gaza declared as a famine zone by the IPC. So till now, we didn't witness this improvement that I can say it can deal with this implications of the famine. We need the fluidity of more aid trucks to get in with different supplementary items that we can provide to these tens of thousands of children, pregnant women, elders who are suffering from acute malnutrition. And this is still critical conditions for them. And also the health facilities in need for rehabilitation, in need for medications and medical supplies in order to help these cases. Also, we are waiting for the medical evacuation of 18,000 patients who are and injured people who are in need for life-saving medical treatment outside Gaza Strip. So all the conditions still, I cannot see any improvement, just light things, which I hope that the international community that continue their pressure in Israel to respect the commitments according to the deal in order to open the crossings and let in aid, mainly for UNRWA. UNRWA has 6,000 trucks loads of aid supplies, which is waiting outside, and UNRWA is delivering from 40 to 50% of these services.
Right, so obviously not all of the crossings have been opened as per what people would like to see, and you mentioned the Rafah crossing there as well. But are more trucks starting to cross the border? Is that something you're hearing? I mean, clearly still not enough is getting in, is the essence of what I'm hearing, though. Yes,
I can say there is more trucks to enter, but with very limited items. As I said, no tents entered till now. So this is one of the priority for the Palestinians to get these tents in Gaza Strip that we can provide directly to these displaced people who lost their homes, the desperate people. And I have high concerns about these women, children, elders, people with disability, and there are no shelter for them. So this is something that we have considered. What had been entered, very limited amount of aid supplies. Yes, there is increase of the number of trucks which was entered, but until now it's not equivalent to the number that's supposed to enter, the 600 trucks supposed to enter every day according to the agreed humanitarian protocol.
Right, and as October progresses, presumably the temperature will start to drop there in Gaza to sort of wintry conditions as the year ends. I mean, there's a lot of talk about reconstruction of Gaza. I mean, clearly in the current context, that must sound rather incredulous. When can reconstruction begin? When can people even start to think about it, do you think?
Yeah, this is very good question, and it's good enhance the hope between the Palestinians. We're talking about the construction of Gaza. 90% of Gaza, about 90%, which is destroyed, and there is about 60 million tons of rubble all over there. And the main point here that we are talking about the humanitarian response, which will be followed by early recovery. And this is a need for political solutions that I hope that first that we can have this permanent ceasefire. And the second, to approve the Palestinian Egyptian Arab plan, which was approved by the different countries and mainly by EU, and to hold this construction conference, which the Egyptian President Sisi mentioned in his statement in Sharm el-Sheikh yesterday. So it will this summit will or construction conference will help us in order to allocate funds from the different states regarding the Gaza construction, and to have this political will and also pressure on Israel to let in the construction materials to be in Gaza, and people that they can recover, and also the infrastructure to start recovering, and also to have this socio-economic recovery as soon as possible. This is needed in order to sustain the ceasefire and to make the people also treated and in better conditions.
Just going back to food aid, I just wanted to ask you briefly about something we heard a lot about from the Israelis, which was that armed groups were intercepting aid deliveries and stealing the aid or obstructing the delivery of the aid. I mean, did you see that? And is that something that's still happening, or was it never happening in the first place?
These groups were created in areas which under the Israeli control. And this is engineered chaos by Israel in order to steal the aid and to waste it, and at the same time, this aid not to reach the distribution points run by the humanitarian organizations, the UN, INGOs, and national NGOs, in order to have safe, dignified distribution. They need this chaos, and we witnessed this in what's called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, also on the unsafe roads for the humanitarian convoys where people were killed and also insulted in the same time. So this is part of the things that we are looking forward to declaring the humanitarian protocol in order to find safe roads for these convoys in order to be distributed directly with no constraints and with no looting of this aid.
Mr. Shawa, obviously it's been 24 months since schooling was a normal thing for children to be able to do. I mean, is there a chance that sort of educational facilities will start operating as usual in the weeks ahead there now in Gaza?
By chance, you are talking today, and today Tawjihi, the high school exams results were announced, and about 27,000 students applied these exams, and today there was the results. So there was so many happiness amongst the families who lost 2 years of their education. But for the basic education, I'm saying that we did our hard work regarding establishment of hundreds of temporary learning spaces, which is about tents, in order that these children to go to these tents to receive some lessons and to get back the education. But for the Israeli attacks, I think it was very complicated, risky to collect the children and the students. And for the also for the higher education, for the universities, we have this digital education, which was good, but the digital infrastructure in Gaza Strip is very weak. that these students to receive education, but we will continue our work as humanitarians in order to get whatever we can of the capacities for these children and for these students to continue their education. And we hope in the ceasefire time that we can resume the education, although that the most 90% of the schools were destroyed and so many of these children were killed. And these children also who are alive, they carried trauma and their mental health is attacked by the Israelis. So we hope that we can, through this time, we can recover through psychosocial support and education process can be back in not in better way, but as maximum as we can do.
There are obviously lots of organisations working on the ground, and this is something that I wanted to ask you about because I think it might be related to what you do. I was just wondering how local NGOs and the major international agencies, you know, like the UN, the Red Cross, how do they all coordinate amongst themselves and make sure that they're not doubling up on their efforts in one area and neglecting their efforts in another area?
Yeah, it's a good question. Again, this is something that we are working through Humanitarian country team, which composed of the UN agencies, the national NGOs, the international organizations, in order to coordinate also in different clusters that these NGOs and agencies are working together in order to put the priorities and to organize their interventions in the different priority areas that we are looking forward. Although that we are part of the big challenges, the shortage of aid supplies, the restrictions of the Israelis, also the Israelis' attacks on the humanitarian workers and organizations. We lost hundreds of aid workers. Also the restrictions that Israel imposed and the banning of UNRWA, the biggest UN agency, and also the INGOs that they have new registration system imposed by Israel, and it restricts their work and their entry of their supplies to Gaza Strip. Also, we as national NGOs, our premises were destroyed. About 80% of our premises, headquarters and capacities were destroyed. So we are working from the tents, from the shelter, from wherever that we can manage to work. It's a lot of work we are doing all together, mainly the national NGOs who are still the frontliner to respond to the needs of the people.
I know you mentioned at the beginning that there had been some further violence today and that people had been killed there in Gaza, but obviously on a much smaller scale than a couple of weeks ago. And I just wanted to ask you, just as we bring this conversation to a close, how nervous are people there in Gaza that there could be a resumption of hostilities and that the diplomatic efforts could somehow yield no results?
For sure, people are nervous and they are scared in order to that war be back by these statements from the Israeli side that they will resume the war in Gaza, they will make less aid to enter. This is make kind of worries and the traumas amongst the people. After the people get this joy and relax, now they are in very tentative conditions that if this ceasefire will not go forward, this for sure that will get more tension from the people. So we are looking forward. This ceasefire will continue, and we are looking that the mediators to do their job in order to solve all the problems regarding this. And our people in very critical moments that we passed, displaced people that we, 24 months, we calculated them by second, by minute. It's not easy mission to live in such condition through the daily killing. Each family lost one of their beloved one, and at the same time, they have damages or destruction of their belongings, their homes, and they lost their incomes. At the same time, displacement, which is not the easy mission, to be displaced to nowhere, to unsafe, and we passed through the starvation. All of us, we were starved. All that we as a humanitarian actors, we didn't receive at least less than 1 meal a day. So this is past, and till now that we are suffering, but not as before.
Okay, well, we really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Thank you very much indeed. Amjad, Shawa, thank you very much indeed. Well, we can speak now to Hady, who is a former US Special Representative for Palestinian Affairs under President Biden. He's currently with the Brookings Institute. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. I just wanted to ask you, first of all, since you served under President Biden, what you made of the fact that both he and President Clinton have heaped praise on President Trump for his Gaza ceasefire plan. It's unusual, isn't it?
Look, I think it's a good thing. And I think what should be clear to all of us is that half a century of the United States, Europe, and the Arab world asking nicely to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been a failure. The United States really needs to act like a superpower to get the kind of results that we've seen.
I mean, interesting to hear Mr. Trump saying that phase 2 of the 20-point plan has now started, he said, and he's predicting tremendous success, tremendous progress, more like. I just wondered if that was your prediction as well.
Look, Donald Trump is a showman. People are kind of afraid of him, and so they follow along. I think we just don't know yet, and there are many reasons to predict. There are many reasons that augur for success, and there are many reasons that augur for failure. What is clear is that we're going to need sustained pressure from the United States, from the Arab world, from Europe, to advance to a future that I think we all want, which is one where Israelis and Palestinians can enjoy the same freedom, the same rights, the same security, because without that, we won't build peace. What we have now is more of a ceasefire deal and less of a final status peace deal. There are no references to UN resolutions, et cetera. So again, there are things that augur in both directions.
There are those who say that the most difficult elements of Mr. Trump's plan are yet to be negotiated. Does that sound about right to you?
Absolutely. Look, I mean, again, it's not a peace plan. It's more of a ceasefire agreement leading to a stage 2 of a ceasefire agreement. And look, we can't forget, right? In addition to the 1,200 Israelis and foreigners who were killed on October 7, 2023, the Palestinian population of Gaza has endured the equivalent of an October 7th level of deaths every 2 weeks for the last 2 years, leading to 67,000 deaths. There is the vast majority of the housing stock has been destroyed. There is so much trauma that has been experienced by the million Palestinian children and the million Palestinian adults in Gaza that we're in a very painful place. And in addition to that, we also can't forget that in terms of deaths, the last 2 years in the West Bank have been the deadliest years basically on record, or as deadly as any years on record. The situation there is also absolutely fragile and dangerous.
So of all the unresolved issues, which one would you say perhaps stands out as being perhaps the most difficult to overcome?
Look, I think it's difficult to pin it to one issue, but what I would say is, the central challenge here is that this 20-point plan was basically developed without the Palestinians. It was negotiated between Trump, Qatar, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the Israelis. And so there are so many issues that we see in the plan that that have challenges. And look, I mean, as an example, right, if you get down to points, 18, 19, and 20, point 19, says, well, as Palestinian reform is faithfully carried out, the conditions may finally be in place for a credible pathway for Palestinian self-determination and statehood, right? Netanyahu has already gone out to his right flank and said, don't worry, that's never going to happen, right? And so it's such a tenuous, conditional, well, if the Palestinians do all the right things, maybe we can start talking about a pathway to statehood in the future. That's clearly not going to fly for Palestinians. After what they've endured, the slaughter that the Palestinian people have endured for the last 2 years, I think continuing for another half century of stalling for equal rights, equal freedoms for the Palestinian people just isn't ultimately going to fly.
Yeah, you highlight those points from the 20-point plan. I mean, some of the other obvious ones as well are the fact that Israel's saying, basically there cannot be peace until Hamas gives up its weapons and ceases to control Gaza. And Hamas, of course, rejects those two demands. I mean, deadlock, isn't it?
That's in the immediate term, right? But what does provide a modicum of hope, and you can't just pin your hopes, you can't just have hope, you've got to take action, is that really for the first time, Donald Trump, the president of the United States, is implicated in this. They've committed 200 U.S. troops not to be on the ground, but to be kind of virtual observers of what's going on. And the states that eventually contribute troops to securing Gaza and an international security force, all of those countries are going to be implicated in the process. And for the first time in a substantial way ever, really, in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, going back to World War II, we're going to have international troops on the ground securing the peace. Those are trying to secure the peace. Those troops are going to see the reality on the ground. They're going to see, is Hamas, violating an agreement or a ceasefire, or is Israel? And so I think there's a way to create the condition of consequences for what happens and doesn't happen. And I think it's going to be very interesting, right? And additionally, right, we know we're going to have Israeli elections in a year or less. They're scheduled for a year, but could unwind earlier. We know that the Palestinian people and leadership also desperately want elections, which Israel is obligated to allow to move forward, even though they've stymied them in the past. So I think what we have now is we do have an agreement, but we have a lot of new dynamics that are unleashed here that are going to develop lives of their own. And it's going to be very interesting to see. It's going to be critical to see how they develop.
Yeah, well, maybe those new dynamics will prove to be no bad thing, because after all, the Trump administration approaches this and other long-standing issues with, a different sort of an approach, a novel approach. And if previous approaches didn't work, who's to say that President Trump and his approach will not?
Absolutely. Look, as you noted, I've served under previous administrations, not those of Donald Trump. But you've got to kind of tip your hat to the pressure he was willing to exert. I think Netanyahu came to Washington a few weeks ago, thought he could kind of use 1990s talking points to kind of talk Donald Trump out of this. He wasn't able to do that. As soon as he had the press conference with Donald Trump agreeing to the deal, he went out in Hebrew and said to his constituents, his ultra right-wing national government partners, "Don't worry, this is never going to happen. There's never going to be a pathway to a Palestinian state. Hamas is never going to agree to this." And here we are, right? And so, Donald Trump buttering up Netanyahu in Israel, it only gives him more leverage over the process. The question is Trump going to be willing to use it? Will he be willing and interested to continue to put pressure on all the parties, including Israel, to make progress towards peace? Donald Trump has said, right, he wants this to be, a permanent peace deal that ends the conflict. I think we're incredibly far away from that. On the other hand, Donald Trump seems to be passionate about a Nobel Peace Prize, and maybe that will continue to motivate him to keep the pressure on.
We've talked a lot about President Trump and the U.S. effort. I want to ask you a little bit about Hamas and where they stand, because they carried out some public executions in Gaza today, going after, they said, collaborators, drug dealers, bandits who apparently have been stealing food. And I'm just wondering what that tells us about how they see their position. I mean, do you see that as Hamas tightening their grip in a way?
So thank you for raising that. And I've only just now been seeing reports of that, so I don't have the details. But if that is indeed the case, right, what is going on is, yes, Hamas is saying, we're here, we're going to be providing law and order. And extrajudicial killings are, of course, entirely unacceptable by any party, especially including Hamas, right? So it's entirely unacceptable. That said, they haven't had to face the music yet. We don't really have international troops coming in to kind of seize authority in Gaza, and that's really when Trump is going to have to face the music of. Are they going to lay down arms or not? What is clear, though, and Israeli interlocutors, I'm sure, are able to tell you this, right? That it's been for several months now. Israeli intelligence and Israeli military officials have considered Hamas to have been defeated, essentially. So they are a shell of their former selves. They don't have rockets to fire at Israel. They don't have a massive command and control capability. This is now a decimated kind of ragtag group of individuals that are trying to exert control. But again, it's going to come back to if an international security force goes into Gaza, that's really where the rubber is going to meet the road, and we're going to see how Hamas is going to react.
Hady, there was one analyst quoted in the New York Times today, I believe it was, who put forward a scenario, one of the possible scenarios, there are obviously many, in which he said the status quo lingers on. Hamas is still armed. The Israeli military refuses to withdraw from Gaza. Do you think that's a real risk, that sort of a status quo takes root?
Absolutely. Look, we are, and by the way, the status quo lingers on in the West Bank, where settlers and the IDF have again killed more Palestinians in the last 2 years than just about any 2 years on record. It's been an absolutely horrific time there as well. And so, yes, the status quo lingers on, but there is a glimmer. There is the prospect that with U.S., European, Arab involvement on the ground, if this interim security force goes on the ground in Gaza, if there are U.S. military observers tracking the situation, again, for the first time effectively in Israeli-Palestinian history, or modern history since the 1940s, with the exception of one small thing in Hebron, this has the potential to open up the situation and move it in the direction of the peace, justice, and equality that Israelis and Palestinians deserve. But that's absolutely right as well.
Just lastly, before we wrap up, I mean, to end on a positive note, President Trump said on Monday, this was, quote, the historic dawn of a new Middle East. I mean, it certainly sounds like the momentum is there, doesn't it?
Look, I think that's a dramatic overstatement, but at the same time, what we saw with the Gulf states and broader Muslim world coming together around and after Netanyahu's brazen and unacceptable attack on Qatar, joining up, basically coming to Washington and saying enough is enough, going to Hamas and saying enough is enough. I think, if the Arab world gets united around an effective plan, if the U.S. is willing to put its weight behind it, if the Palestinian leadership, plays its cards right, we can maybe move to a place where there are new Palestinian elections, there's a new Palestinian leadership, and there's going to be new Israeli elections as well. Now, that's an optimistic scenario that I think I certainly wouldn't bet on, but it's not impossible, and it's what we should all be working towards.
Okay, well, we really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Always a pleasure talking to you, Hady Amr. Thank you very much indeed for your time, sir.
Thank you for convening this important discussion.
Well, we can speak now to Daniel Levy, a former Israeli peace negotiator. You were an Israeli negotiator during the Oslo peace process. You now run the Policy Institute, the US Middle East project. You join us from London. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. We've heard President Trump in the last 24 hours or so saying phase 2 of his 20-point plan has started. He's predicting what he called tremendous progress. Is that your prediction?
I'd love for it to be, because the people there deserve nothing more. But that doesn't accord with already the reality we're seeing on the ground. Israel is preventing the aid trucks from going in. You've had Palestinians already killed. Israel remains in 50% of the Gaza Strip. That means that in many of what were the main residential areas of Gaza before they were destroyed, but where Palestinians in Gaza are trying to go back to pick up the pieces of their lives, in many of those cities and neighborhoods, Israel is in part of those neighborhoods. That is a recipe for ongoing friction and tension. So let's be clear. Huge relief. The Israelis who are held, the men of military age, the remaining 20 reunited with their families, emotional scenes. Palestinian prisoners who were sentenced in Israeli military tribunals as part of that illegal occupation were released. Most important, perhaps, of all in terms of the number of people it impacted, the daily bombing, starvation, displacement, destruction and killing have come to an end. But I think we have to be realistic. There is no phase 2. Nothing more was agreed. And the West Bank, for instance, isn't even mentioned in the 20 points.
Right, so what you're saying is getting the hostages out, the subsequent prisoner release, that was actually, in some respects, the easy part, and the harder part is going to be getting Hamas to give up its weapons and demilitarizing the Gaza Strip.
Well, I don't understand. Sorry, I lost you.
I was just saying, I mean, it sounds as though some people, and you seem to be one of them as well, saying that, you know, in some respects, the easy part is now done. The much harder part is yet to be done.
Well, I don't want to call it the easy part, okay? Because it wasn't easy. And what I think happened was that, first of all, Netanyahu didn't want this. Trump cornered him. Secondly, Hamas said to the regional mediating parties, but we need an ironclad guarantee that the war will end. They said, well, the best we can get you is to put the bar really high. And I think a lot of the ceremony around what happened in Sharm, around the Knesset, was to say, listen, it's not going to be easy for you to renege and go back and do this again. Look, everyone's bought into this. So it's not that that was easy. It's that that's what was agreed. Nothing else was agreed. Now, someone might say, well, if leaving the rest vague was the way to get this initial ceasefire, at least get a stop to that, at least get the things we've seen, then go with that and see what happens next. I'm willing to do that. But the big question is, what does happen next? And there is nothing in the text which actually nails that down. So it says in the text, and this is correct and accurate, that Hamas have said they will not play a part in the future governance of Gaza. And that has been a Hamas position for many years now, preceding 7th of October 2023. They were ready to hand over to an agreed, legitimate, restructured PLO and Palestinian governing authority. What you don't have is a Hamas commitment to disarm. I'm not familiar with any case in history where a resistance movement, where any people under a permanent illegal occupation of structural violence says we have no right to resist under these circumstances. They have to abide by international law, but they do have a right to resist. Hamas is not going under these circumstances to give up its weapons. So that was a red herring actually put in there, which will probably upend significant parts of this deal. What you could do, if there was the intention to be serious and to move forward, then what you can do is take what Hamas have said, and this is that there could be the non-use, the non-display of weapons, the handing over of heavy weapons to a legitimate Palestinian entity in Gaza. You could move forward with that. You could get the international stabilization force in, and then you could get Israel to adhere to the full withdrawal from Gaza. Then, of course, come on to the maintained and continued occupation and apartheid in the West Bank. But you don't have a serious document. And therefore, it's going to be very difficult moving forward, especially since the Trump administration isn't really committed to any of these things. They showed their hand in the first Trump administration with the so-called Peace to Prosperity Plan. They've shown their hand with the recognition of Israel's illegal annexation of Jerusalem. So you would have to see a significant shift in the Trump administration position in order for them then to lean on Israel. Of course, there could be other external pressure to lean on Israel as well, as we have seen in the last few weeks and months.
Well, we've even heard, though, President Clinton and President Biden heaping praise on Donald Trump for getting as far as he's got. And just to sort of rebut one of our other points, some of the analysts we've spoken to have said that, simplicity is very much the beauty of the 20-point plan. And that was, the fact that it was simple was what made it effective. How do you respond to that?
Analysts can also be simple. And I fear that that's what we're talking about here. Yes, I've already said, you can say that getting to a ceasefire, getting to the mutual exchange release of Israelis held, of Palestinians held, etc., that was perhaps enabled by keeping it simple. But that doesn't get you through the next phase. So does anyone think that the Dayton Accords in the former Yugoslavia, the Good Friday Agreement in Ireland, could have been achieved on one flimsy piece of paper which says virtually nothing? No, these are serious documents. They speak to an intention on the part of the warring parties to go to a different future. And they speak to the fact that there was pressure for them to do so. Of course, the simplicity of the next phase is unhelpful, not helpful. The fact that Clinton and Biden have welcomed this tells you everything you need to know around the bipartisan consensus among the old American establishment to continue to adhere to helping Israel maintain its permanent occupation and denial of Palestinian rights. Why wouldn't Clinton agree? His administration was part of this. Why wouldn't Biden agree? His administration actually kept the genocide going for 15 months. He failed to even get this far. What you see, though, is a different America. Whether it's the old Democrat establishment or whether it's the Republican establishment, they both belong to an America that is out of touch with its public. Because if you look at where opinion polls are, they are not in that place. They are sick and tired of America being led by the nose, by a country in the region that depends on the US for everything, the weapons, the military, diplomatic, political, financial support, and yet undermines American national security interests, whether it's in the Gulf or elsewhere, consistently. And people want to see, if you're talking Trump MAGA world, there's a fracture in that world between America first and Israel first. I would add to that, of course, that it doesn't do Israel any good to suggest to Israel that you can have your cake and eat it, that you can maintain your control over the Palestinians, maintain your illegal occupation and apartheid, and somehow this will deliver security for you, because it won't, it hasn't in the past, it won't in the future.
We've been talking on the programme about the prisoners who were released by Israel. One of them was not Marwan Barghouti. And I wanted to ask your opinion. Why don't you think he was one of them?
Well, I think it's a very important fact that Marwan wasn't released. I think that could have been a significant contribution to a factor that we haven't discussed, Tom, which is Palestinian politics needs renewing, needs reunifying. It doesn't need reforming according to a menu that is written by Washington and Israel and other European Western allies. It needs to be responsive to the Palestinian public. And I think there was basically, and I think this is part of what the deal was, there was basically a full press on the Hamas and other factions who were part of that negotiation on the Palestinian side, who were holding Israelis, and on the Israelis to get this done. I think Marwan would have been a deal breaker on the Israeli side. I don't think Netanyahu could have held his coalition together. And I think the Israelis won that one. But I also think that that was because too many people saw in Marwan a threat to the very convenient current structures of the Palestinian Authority, convenient to Israel, convenient to Israel's allies in the West, even those who dislike the PA and don't want to engage with the PA. They're a very useful holding place for an absence of Palestinian politics and strategy. And therefore, I think this was too convenient all round for it to successfully be addressed in the talks.
So just to wrap up briefly, you're not giving, it doesn't sound, a huge amount of credit to Mr. Trump for getting us to the point we've got to.
Look, you mentioned Joe Biden. I give Trump credit for getting to this point, which Biden failed to do. I think we should acknowledge this was, in significant measure, America's war, because Israel could not have continued this without American armaments, without American support. It was therefore also America's deal to end the war. But what he has done is a really important step towards ending a genocide. Normally, when such a thing happens, you then hold the party that has been committing a genocide accountable. Instead, that party has been embraced and has been allowed to write the terms of the post-genocide reality. And that is going to lead us to further sorrow, more bad days ahead, unless we can change that trajectory, which I desperately hope we can, because no one wants to live through more days like this.
Former Israeli peace negotiator Daniel Levy, thank you very much indeed for your time, sir.
Thank you so much.
We can speak now to Peter Klepp, who is the editor-in-chief of the Brussels Report. He joins us now from the Belgian capital. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us, Peter. Clearly a lot of optimism in Washington that when you hear language like what President Trump used yesterday, saying this was the dawn of a new era for the Middle East. Is that sense of optimism shared, do you feel, where you are there in the heart of Europe?
Well, yes, also here a lot of observers are quite optimistic. The head of the European External Action Service, which is sort of the EU diplomatic service, also congratulated American President Trump with his achievement here. But then if you look at the history of ceasefires tend not to last, unfortunately. Also the fact that sort of Hamas is gaining back some control to a degree. There's some other elements as well. The fact that Hamas does not seem able to return all the bodies of all the Israeli hostages. So there's a number of elements of concern. But broadly, yes, people think that this should stick at least for a while.
Yeah, it's a difficult deal, isn't it, to strike, and inevitably it wasn't going to be plain sailing. So all things considered, and given the level of mistrust on both sides, do you think it's fair to say this 20-point plan and its implementation so far has been as good as perhaps could realistically be expected?
So far, so good. To be fair, it doesn't seem to be on the verge of collapsing, at least. And I think a lot will now depend on future arrangements being negotiated. Who will actually serve as the police force of Gaza? I mean, will we allow Hamas to continue to do that, which is the case now? To what extent will regional powers be willing to engage in Gaza, not just financially, but also by deploying some military capacity? A lot of that is very unclear. Also because if that were to happen, there will be a big discussion on the rules of engagement. So there's so many question marks left at this point. And of course, it's normal that you can't just sort this out in such a short period of time. But yeah, I think great challenges remain.
And Peter, which European powers are viewed as having been the most proactive and the most involved in helping to get us to the point we're at now?
Well, France is very keen to play a role, both by providing some security assets. It's not exactly clear to what extent and how far France will go, And secondly, also by trying to convince regional powers to engage. So I think, yeah, France and of course the UK as well, they are quite keen to to make a positive contribution here. So far, obviously, most of the leverage was with the Americans, given how much influence they have over the region. The fact that European governments have fallen out with Israel is also not really helping them at this point to have leverage. But yeah, they're trying to contribute what is possible.
I mean, there are quite different narratives and sort of talking points, aren't there, when you look at the sorts of messaging that comes out of Washington and the sorts of messages you get out of major European capitals. For example, you hear President Macron lambasting Israel for expanding settlements in the West Bank. That's not something you hear, is it, too much from the US delegations?
That is true. When it comes to that specific point, U.S. pressure has been more sort of behind the scenes. But I think in Washington, there's a consensus that this is also not very helpful, the expansion of the settlements. On the other hand, you do hear, even in Europe, even people on the left saying, look, we'll have to find some kind of an arrangement with that. At this point, there's so many people living in the West Bank that, just sort of emptying the West Bank, as Sharon, the former Israeli prime minister, has done with Gaza, is no longer feasible. And I think, those are some tough questions that also people in Europe that are, let's say, at this point closer to the Palestinian position, that they will have to confront in the next few years, when an arrangement will need to be found, not just for Gaza, but for the overall situation in the region.
And I'm wondering whether you think, to a certain extent, public policy and statements you hear from world leaders on this issue in Europe is driven in some part by public opinion, which is much more vocal, isn't it, on the issue of the Palestinians and the support for them having a state of their own. That's not something you hear quite so much of, is it, in the United States?
Yeah, absolutely. But then even in the US, especially among the left, you can argue that the Palestinian cause is absolutely a top priority. The thing is here that many people are supporting this for different reasons. For some it's some kind of a tribal leftist cause. For others, it's a genuine concern with the plight of the Palestinians. Some would go so far as sort of brushing off the crimes of Hamas. Others make a big distinction. So it's a broad coalition. But I think fundamentally Israel remains, a Western democracy despite its faults. And I do think that should eventually end up in Western European governments engaging more closely again with Israel, especially because since the Abraham Accords, Israel has also been reaching out with partners in the region. So when when hopefully this terrible Gaza war is now over, perhaps there's a prospect also for these relationships to be restored again.
I mean, there have been various roles touted for the EU and for European leaders and European nations in helping to bring some stability to the region, whether it's observer roles, peacekeeping roles, mediating roles. I mean, what do you see as being the European value add in this whole conundrum?
Well, European governments will certainly offer some financial support. If some mediating roles are required, I think they will also be ready to provide this. In terms of hard military assets, I can only think of France and the UK willing/able to offer that. But even then, that will only be sort of on the sidelines. I think when you're talking about Gaza, to the extent that Israel, of course, permits this, I think only regional powers will ultimately, be able to, help out with security there.
Do you see Brussels, I mean, I'm talking about the EU here, opening its purse strings and helping to finance some of the reconstruction effort, which is going to be hugely expensive and hugely complicated?
I can imagine that this will be the case, that European governments will try to contribute here. Now, there's one thing that we should not forget, as important as Gaza is for many of the European public. There's a war going on the European continent in Ukraine, which is objectively a far greater geopolitical danger to Europe's security than whatever happens in Gaza, as serious as this also is. So I think if you're talking about financial resources, at the end of the day, European governments will be forced to prioritize the Ukraine issue. But given the pressure of public opinion, they will also certainly, see Gaza and the reconstruction there as a priority.
You make a really good point there, Peter, because actually in the last 48 hours, Ukraine has suddenly become an issue again. And some said that on October the 7th, 2023, events in Gaza really eclipsed events in Ukraine. And it seems that did happen for a period of several months, if not the entire duration of the 24-month-long war. And there's also talk of the blueprint for this 20-point plan being applied somehow to mediating an end to the war between Russia and Ukraine. Are those things that people in Europe are now discussing in a major way?
Well, it looks like President Trump is now turning his attention to fixing Ukraine. He's meeting the Ukrainian President Zelensky. But indeed, some of the lessons learned in, trying to solve the Gaza crisis, will definitely be applied to Ukraine as well. But at the end of the day, to the same extent that the terrible crisis in Sudan is being overshadowed by the events in Gaza, I think for Europe, and especially Eastern Europe, at the end of the day, the crisis or the war in Ukraine is, is very much at their doorstep, and that will always manifest itself.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Peter Klepp, Editor-in-Chief at the Brussels Report. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed for watching. That's all we've got time for on Global News today. We look forward to seeing you again tomorrow with more exclusive interviews. Until then, bye-bye.